The most important forces at Kursk were not always the ones firing at the front line. Behind the Soviet defensive belts, beyond the trenches, minefields, anti-tank guns, and artillery positions, powerful reserves waited for the moment when the German offensive would reveal its direction and spend its strength. This was one of the hardest parts of the Soviet plan, because holding back strong formations while forward troops suffered required discipline, confidence, and a clear sense of timing. Kursk matters in armored warfare history, not only because of the tanks already in battle, but because of the tanks and infantry deliberately kept out of battle until their movement could change the campaign. The Soviet reserves were the hidden fist behind the defensive shield.
If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore.
A reserve is sometimes imagined as extra strength, a force simply waiting because it has not yet been needed. At Kursk, the concept was much more active than that. The Soviet High Command, known as Stavka, had placed major formations behind the Central and Voronezh fronts so they could respond to the German attack once its main weight became clear. This was not hesitation or indecision. It was a planned sequence. First absorb, then slow, then identify, and only then commit the deeper power. The Red Army had learned through bitter experience that reserves thrown in too early could be wasted in fragments. A reserve kept intact could become the difference between surviving a crisis and turning that crisis into a counterstroke.
The most important reserve formation in this larger design was Ivan Konev's Steppe front, positioned behind the Kursk salient rather than along the first line of defense. Konev's command included armies that could reinforce threatened sectors or join a larger Soviet offensive once the German attack had lost momentum. Among its most famous components was Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, a powerful armored force that would soon become closely tied to the story of Prokhorovka. The word Guards indicated an elite status earned by performance and political recognition, though elite did not mean immune from confusion, mistakes, or loss. These formations were not being saved for ceremony, they were being preserved for timing.
The decision to hold reserves mattered because the German offensive was not evenly dangerous everywhere. In the north, Model's 9th Army was being slowed and contained by Rokossovsky's Central Front. In the south, Manstein's forces, especially Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, made deeper gains and created the real crisis of Operation Citadel. A commander looking only at the forward edge might have been tempted to rush every available formation into the first threatened sector. But Soviet leaders had to think beyond the first alarm. They needed to know whether German progress was a local penetration, a developing breakthrough, or the beginning of an operational rupture. Reserves were useful only if committed to the right problem at the right time.
Moving reserves in mechanized war is itself a military operation. Tank armies do not glide effortlessly from one sector to another. They require fuel, ammunition, repair support, traffic control, bridges, routes, anti-aircraft protection, and command arrangements that remain clear despite dust, darkness, and fear. A tank that arrives without fuel is not a reserve, it is a burden. Infantry arriving late may leave armor exposed. Artillery that cannot keep up may leave a counterattack without weight. At Kursk, the Soviet reserve system depended on roads and railways behind the front, on staff work that organized movement, and on commanders who had to judge when waiting became more dangerous than moving.
The movement of reserves also depended on information. Soviet commanders needed to know where the German spearheads were, how fast they were advancing, which defensive belts still held, and where the main threat might turn next. Reports came from reconnaissance, frontline units, artillery observers failed, and units under pressure often sent reports shaped by fear or incomplete knowledge. This uncertainty made the reserve decision more difficult. Commit too soon, and a tank army might be thrown against the wrong sector. Commit too late, and the German armor might already have broken into ground where it could move freely.
There was also a human cost to restraint. Forward Soviet soldiers in trenches and gun positions paid heavily, while deeper formations waited. To the men under bombardment, the logic of operational timing could feel distant and cruel. Riflemen, engineers, anti-tank crews, and local tank units had to hold long enough for the larger design to work. Their sacrifice created the conditions in which the reserves could matter. This is a severe truth about Kursk, and about modern war generally. Commanders may speak of depth, timing, and operational design, but those ideas are purchased by people holding under fire, while others remain behind the line for reasons that may be invisible in the moment. On the southern face, the need for reserves grew more urgent as German armored formations pushed through the belts and toward the approaches that led toward Oboyan and Prokhorovka. Vatutsin's Voronezh front bent under pressure, and the German advance forced the Soviet command to decide how much strength to release. Local reserves helped block penetrations and restore positions, but the deeper reserves had a different purpose. They were meant to strike with enough weight to change the direction of the battle, not simply plug every gap as it appeared. This distinction mattered. A reserve used as a patch might save a local line. A reserve used as a weapon might alter the campaign. When reserves move, they bring more than tanks. A major Soviet counterstroke required infantry to seize and hold ground, artillery to prepare and support attacks, engineers to deal with mines and obstacles, anti-aircraft units to protect concentrations, and logistics to sustain the whole effort once it began. The image of a tank army rolling forward is powerful, but it hides the columns behind it. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, repair teams, headquarters vehicles, medical support, and road control detachments. The Red Army's growing strength in 1943 lay partly in its ability to assemble these systems at scale. Soviet operations could still be blunt and costly, but they were increasingly able to turn mass into operational effect. The German command understood the danger of Soviet reserves, though it could not always see their precise location or timing. A panzer spearhead that is fought for days through mines and defensive belts is dangerous, but it is also tired, damaged, and increasingly dependent on narrow routes back to its supplies. If a fresh enemy reserve strikes at the right moment, it can turn an advance into a crisis. This is why the German need for speed at Kursk was so urgent. The longer Citadel continued without decisive breakthrough, the more likely it became that the Soviet reserves would enter the battle on their own terms. The Germans were not simply racing the first defensive line. They were racing the moment when the deeper Soviet armies began to move. The movement of reserves was not a guarantee of Soviet success. Large formations arriving near the battlefield could become congested, misdirected, or committed before reconnaissance was complete. Tank armies could be forced into unfavorable terrain or ordered forward under time pressure. Coordination between fronts, armies, artillery, and aircraft could fail under the stress of events. Kursk should not be simplified into a story of perfect Soviet planning unfolding cleanly. The Red Army's strength was real, but it often expressed itself through costly, improvised, and imperfect action. What mattered was that the Soviets had preserved enough organized power to act after the Germans had already spent much of theirs. The reserves moving toward the southern crisis marked the transition from the first phase of Kursk to the next. The defensive shield had done its work by slowing the German attack, but a shield alone could not finish the campaign. The Soviet plan required a punch, and that punch now began to move into position. The most important battlefield forces were no longer only the men holding trenches, or the German crews pushing northward through dust and mines. They were also the columns coming up from depth, the commanders deciding where to commit them, and the supply systems straining to make that commitment real. At Kursk, the moment of restraint was ending. The reserves were moving, and the battle was bending toward Prokhorovka.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.